well, I'm going to begin by asking, I mean, what ties this, I think, in with your preceding feature was, it seems that you're quite fascinated in what makes people, in a sense that, you know, when you get sort of like in the last one, it's kind of looking into what makes people when they're a child. So we're looking into here what a huge sort of superstar, but delving into the early years, kind of before they become that superstar.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what it is about that kind of period of a life that appeals to you.
I mean, you know, so basically, I've never thought of the movies as character studies, or I've always thought of them as origin stories, like that. You're absolutely right. But the idea has always been to use a character to sort of track a nation's development as well as a generation's development. So it's more, both films are less about the individual than they are about the moment in time that they're living in, and so, you know, the best example of it in a novel is a book that Robert Musil wrote called The Man Without Qualities, that has this very specific, quite dry narration that's super funny, but it's very tragic, and it's sort of about the fall of the Austrian Empire. But it tracks this one, you know, hapless character, the man without qualities. So when I sat down to make this, I was trying to think of, like, I started initially with this adult character, and I thought, oh, the woman without qualities. What does that look like? And I sort of walked it back from there. So the idea was to take a look at how different things actually were just 20 years ago. I mean, you know, they've reached the moment in time that we're living in have reached absurd maximalist new heights, especially with this administration, or the current administration in the U.S. And so, you know, I find that the intersection of pop cultural trends and trends in violence and the news cycle, and the intersection between fame and infamy, and how all of these things have sort of become one and the same, and so, you know, everything is less defined, and nothing is shocking anymore as a result of everything becoming less and less defined. There are pros and cons to the way in which we're evolving, of course, but I think there's much to be cynical about.
Yeah, because it's quite a difficult period of time to look back on, because this is quite recent history. I mean, when you think of that, the 80s, you kind of get into almost quite caricature. You think some high tops and then play some Duran Duran, and that's the 80s. But to portray 20 years ago, because there hasn't been a huge amount of distance, was it a challenge to understand what the world was like only 2 decades ago?
Totally it was. It was really difficult to figure out, you know, how the spectator would even be able to identify what's changed between now and then. I mean, you know, in New York City, the parking meters have changed, the brands have changed, some of the signage has changed, but subtly, the taxis have changed. So it was hard to find, you know, a lot to grab onto. But you know, with all of the period vehicles and stuff in the beginning and the chain of ambulances, that was the first image I saw where I felt taken to another moment in time. And you know, basically, the moment in time that we're living in right now, especially in the entertainment sphere, has become, you know, increasingly garish. So actually, it was quite easy to at least define the way that this child dressed and behaved in 2001 versus how this adult behaves in 2017, and obviously looks.
And one of the other things that obviously has changed over that time is music. And I was wondering about how important it was to get that right, because you feature original songs in this that she's singing. And I was wondering about, sort of like having music written.
Yeah, it was quite specific. I mean, we used synths and stuff from the period for everything that was recorded for part one. And so, I mean, in terms of the texture of the music from that section versus the more EDM-influenced tracks in part two, I mean, everything is quite correct. The only song which sort of serves as a bridge between that part and part two is this more EDM-influenced track of when Raffey's on the back of the motorcycle. But even though it was sort of anachronistic, the texture and sound of this track, I liked it because it seemed to sort of anticipate the coming of something new, a new generation. And so, you know, the movies, both Childhood and Vox, are virtual histories. So, I mean, I take what I like and what makes sense for the movies, and you know, there's no cell phones or anything in the 2017 portion of the movie. And obviously, if it was more true to life, they'd be all over the place. But they're just quite ugly, and I didn't want to shoot them because I always find it distracting when I see like an iPhone face in a movie. It sort of takes me out of it. So the movies are absolutely channeled through my imagination, and they're not neo-realist dramas. I
was wondering too about the one of the things that does tie the two stories together is having Raffey in both sections. What was the decision in that instance to employ the same actress for those two roles? Was that an idea that was in your head when you first crafted the screenplay, or was it through meeting Raffey that you decided that would be a good idea?
Yeah, it was always the plan. I mean, basically, one of the first scenes that I imagined was this scene with Natalie and Raffey in the diner, and I thought, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if you have this character that takes their younger selves out for lunch and gives their younger self a lot of bad advice. And I thought that there would be something kind of perverse and fascinating about it. But there were other reasons too. I mean, the idea that every generation is trying to improve on the generation prior. And so that, you know, the fact that our children resemble us, but usually, certainly in my case, a better version of ourselves, you know, both physically and mentally. I mean, my child speaks, you know, several languages, and she's 4 years old, so she's already ahead of the curve. So at the end of the movie, I knew that Celeste's story was, you know, ultimately tragic. There was nowhere for this character to go, and yet I thought that a way of having an ending that was true to that character's demise, but still had just a sliver of optimism, was that her child, who appears exactly as she did as a young girl in part one, that perhaps, you know, perhaps she'll be all right, or she'll have figured something out that unfortunately our generation has not figured out.
And just to go back to before, when we were speaking about how your films are kind of almost following, it's not just following the characters, but following the world as the world has progressed as well. And you mentioned that we're sort of not shocked by anything at the moment. You know, over the last sort of 2 decades, like you said, it's almost become immune to kind of like big news stories because they're happening so thick and fast. How is that affecting cinema, do you think, and storytellers such as yourself? Do you think this sort of, because we're so kind of immune in some ways to shock now, is that infiltrating into film and into that art form?
Yeah, of course. I mean, look, viewers are really savvy. Viewers are very cynical, and I like that. I mean, I like you know, being confronted with a cynical viewer, because it challenges the filmmaker to make movies that are, you know, trying to invent a new language. I mean, it's not interesting to rehash these things over and over and over again. And both both Childhood and Vox are movies that sort of, you know, mock origin stories. Like, even though they are origin stories, they also poke fun at them. I mean, there's a sleazy manager, and there's a, you know, it's like there are tropes that the film uses and then turns on their head, you know, and it's basically a way of, I hope, giving people access to something, you know, that invites them on board for something that's quite familiar, and then surprises them a great deal with what the actual product is. And you know, it's not to trick people, but it's to excite people. I love being surprised by a film, because I so rarely am. I love being surprised by a song. If something that would normally be, you know, 2.5 minutes is stretched to 11 minutes, I mean, playing with the architecture of the mediums, that's you know, it's very important, because the form is the content. You can't separate the two, and the people that do separate the two are not making very interesting movies.
And just very finally, obviously, you mentioned the fact that these are sort of origin stories, and my head sort of went towards this kind of, obviously there's so many superhero movies at the moment which are very much entrenched in kind of being origin tales.
Sure.
And I was just wondering, I mean, even though your films are sort of really creative, very resourceful kind of indie flicks, so this would seem like an odd question to maybe have asked 10 years ago, but these days, great creative filmmakers, say Ryan Coogler, for example, have taken that little leap and have just tried their hand at a superhero film. And I was just wondering about yourself and as a filmmaker sort of in the future, if you harbour any ambitions, or would you ever entertain the idea of taking on a big studio movie and sort of being a director to hire?
I mean, no, I wouldn't. No. It's not for me. You know, here's the thing. I'm 30 years old. I've spent the majority of my life committed to a very specific kind of movie. I mean, films I acted in were very much in line with the films that I make. I don't think it's very interesting to work for a studio on a $100 million movie, or $200 million movie, or $300 million movie, because the film would no longer be mine. So it's not about the fact that I wouldn't love to make that kind of money or to have that kind of money to work with, but I wouldn't have any freedom, because basically the movie is not, I would have some influence on the shape and rhythm of the movie, you know, to some extent, but you're a director for hire and you are working for a brand. So ultimately Marvel controls the brand. I don't control the brand. So it's not interesting to me, because that sort of renders me useless. I think I don't even know what I'm doing there in those situations. If I'm directing a commercial, you know, I'm just servicing the production. It's not a. It's basically it's primarily created by the people that are paying for it. With a movie like this, you know. This movie, you know, I made. Other people participated in the craftsmanship of the movie, but nobody changed a frame of it. Of course, people tried, but they didn't succeed, which is why the film is unique and a unique expression. And I think that I would have a very difficult time being told what to do. So I would rather live in, you know, a one-bedroom apartment for the rest of my life, making films that I would actually go and see, because, you know, of course there's people doing. For me, one of the most interesting movies of last year was the animated version of Spider-Man.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I thought it was brilliant. I watched it with my kid. Thought it was really subversive, really interesting, really fun. That was the most exhilarated, you know, I'd been watching a superhero movie in a long time. But usually when I see those things, even if I think they're okay or they're good, I think they're good for. It's like, oh, it's good for what it is. It's not great. It's just kind of, it's fine. And so, you know, there are exceptions to the rule, but they're too few. The odds wouldn't be in my favor.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Toby.
No
Appreciate it.
problem.
Thank you. Cheers.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're watching Hey You Guys!
Hey, you guys, huh?
Hey, you guys.
Is that from the Goonies?
It is indeed, yes.
Nice.
Hey,